My name is Margaret Ann Thompson, though most folks just call me Maggie. These days, people know me as Granny Maggie, sitting in this old wooden rocking chair on my porch in North Carolina, telling stories while the cicadas sing. My hair is silver now, my hands wrinkled, but my heart remembers everything as if it happened yesterday. You see, when you live to be nearly 83, your memory holds 1,000 stories, but some of them burn brighter than all the rest. There's one story, my story, that I have carried like a heavy stone in my chest for more than 60 years. It is the story of betrayal, of how someone I trusted, my own uncle, cut the ground out from under my feet. But it is also a story of resilience, of learning that even in the deepest darkness, we can find our way toward the light again. I grew up in the 1950s in a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina. My father was a quiet man, a carpenter who built houses with his bare hands. His back bent from work, but his spirit strong. My mama was gentle, with a laugh like church bells, though sickness clung to her lungs from the time I was little. We were not wealthy, but we had love. And in those days, I thought love was enough to protect us from everything. But I was wrong. When I was 12, tragedy came like a storm. My mama passed away one cold February night. I can still smell a camphor rubbed on the chest, still hear the rattling in her breathing. When she was gone, the house grew quiet in a way I cannot explain. My father worked longer hours to drown his grief, leaving me alone most evenings. That's when my uncle, my mother's younger brother, Edward, though everyone called him Eddie, stepped in. He was handsome, charming, and seemed to have a smile for every person he met. Folks in town trusted him. He worked at the bank, wore fine suits, and spoke with an ease that made people feel safe. To me, a lonely girl, he seemed like a savior. He'd bring me little gifts, a hair ribbon, sometimes even a book from the library. He'd pat my head and say, "Don't you worry, Maggie girl. Your Uncle Eddie will look after you." For a while, I believed him. My father, drowning in sorrow, thought it a blessing that Eddie took interest in me. He didn't see what I began to notice. At first, it was small things. Money missing from the coffee tin Mama had kept. My father's tools borrowed and never returned. Whispers from townsfolk about Eddie gambling on the weekends. I was just a child, but even children can sense when something isn't right. The real betrayal, though, came a few years later when I turned 15. By then, my father had grown weak. His body worn from both grief and labor. He felt ill, and the doctors told us his heart was failing. I remember sitting beside him, clenching his rough hand, praying that God would spare him. But by the following winter, he too was gone. Orphaned before my 16th birthday, I had no one in the world but Uncle Eddie. And oh, how I needed someone then. But instead of sheltering me, Eddie stripped away what little I had left. The day after my father's funeral, Eddie showed up at our home with papers in his hand. He told me Daddy had left Dad's, that the house wasn't truly ours anymore. I didn't understand much about money then. I barely knew how to balance my school lunch allowance. But I knew Daddy had worked hard and saved every penny. Still, Eddie insisted the bank had claims, and as my guardian, he said he would take care of everything. "Don't you worry, Maggie girl," he said again, his smooth voice like oil. "You'll stay with me and Aunt Clara. We'll see you through school. This old house isn't safe for you anymore." I cried that night, sitting on the bare floor of the only home I had ever known. I pressed my face against the walls Daddy had built with his hands, whispering goodbye. By morning,
Eddie had arranged for me to move into his big white house on Maple Street, the one with a porch swing and manicured hedges. At first glance, it seemed a kindness, but soon the cracks showed. Aunt Clara was cold, always criticizing the way I spoke or dressed. Ungrateful little orphan, she muttered when she thought I couldn't hear. I was giving chores from sunrise to sundown, scrubbing floors, washing linens, cooking meals. School became an afterthought, and some days Eddie wouldn't even let me go. It wasn't long before I overheard the truth. One evening, while polishing silverware in the kitchen, I heard Eddie Flowers talking in hushed voices. She believed the bank owned the house, Clover said, that hushed voice. Eddie laughed. Of course she does. What does a 15-year-old know about property deeds? I sold that land last week. Got a good price, too. More than her daddy ever saved. Mopped the third man cold. He didn't save me. He got stolen from me. The house, the land, everything Daddy had worked for. I wanted to scream, to run, to call him out. But I was just a girl, alone and powerless in a world that gave men like Eddie all the authority. That night, lying on high cot in the attic where they made me sleep, I wept until my pillow was soaked. Betrayal burning my chest, hot in grief, heavier than loneliness. My uncle, my own blood, had taken not just my parents' memory, but a legacy. I felt trapped like a bird caged in someone else's house, singing songs no one cared to hear. I longed for Mom's arms or Daddy's steady voice. All I had had memories, and those felt like stands slipping through my fingers. But even in that darkness, something inside me stirred, a quiet, disturbing splunk. Maybe it was Mama's laugh or Daddy's strength living on inside of me. Maybe it was Di's whispering, telling me I was meant for more than this pain. Whatever it was, I promised myself that night I would not let Eddie's betrayal define me. I didn't know how or when, but I swore that one day I would find a way to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my work.
When I look back on those years in Uncle Eddie's house, I feel like I'm watching some other girl live my life. A girl with too much weight on her shoulders, too much sorrow in her eyes. But that girl was me, Margaret Ann, barely 16 and already worn thin by grief and betrayal. Life under Eddie's roof was a strange mix of appearances and cruelty. To the townsfolk, I looked like a lucky orphan. My uncle, the well-dressed banker, had taken me in, given me shelter, and promised to see me through my troubles. People patted my shoulder at church, whispered, "What a blessing, child, that you've got such a fine uncle." But behind closed doors, it was a different story. And Clara treated me less like a niece and more like a servant. Each morning, before the sun rose, she would bang on the attic door. "Up, Margaret! You've got chores waiting." My hands grew red and cracked from scrubbing floors. My back ached from hauling laundry to the line. I wasn't given new clothes. I wore Clara's cast-offs, hemmed and pinned so they wouldn't drag on my frame. At the dinner table, I often ate scraps after everyone else had finished. I remember one night in particular. It was Thanksgiving. Clara had set a grand table. Turkey, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie. Guests from the neighborhood came and everyone laughed and clinked glasses. I served plates, refilled drinks, smiled politely when spoken to. But when the last guest left, Clara pushed a small plate toward me. Cold snuffing and a chicken leg. Hardly enough for a child. "Don't expect more," she said flatly. That was how it went. I was there, but not seen. A shadow in their house. School, my one escape, became harder and harder to attend. Eddie would say, "What's the point of sending her? She's just going to end up working with her hands. Let us stay home and help Clara."
But I begged to go, telling him Mama had always dreamed I'd graduate. Maybe guilt pricked his conscience, or maybe he didn't want the town whispering, but he let me attend, though often I missed days for chores. Still, school gave me something I desperately needed: hope. I found a friend there, Sarah Miller. She was a bright-eyed girl with auburn hair and a spirit that lifted mine whenever I felt crushed. Sarah's family owned a small grocery on Main Street. Nothing fancy, but it was filled with warmth. When she learned bits of what my life was like, she'd slip extra sandwiches into my school bag or lend me a sweater in the winter. One Friday evening, she invited me to her house for supper. I still remember the smell of pot roast filling their kitchen, the sound of her younger brothers bickering over biscuits, the way her mother brushed a stray hair from Sarah's forehead. It felt like stepping into a dream I'd forgotten was possible. A home filled with love, not bitterness. That night, walking back to Eddie's house, my heart ached with both gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for Sarah. Sorrow that my own home had been stolen from me. But it also lit a fire inside me. I wanted a life like that. A family that loved me. A table where laughter was welcome, not forbidden. Eddie, of course, had no idea of my dreams. His world revolved around money, cards, and appearances. And some nights, he came home late, smelling of whiskey and smoke. I'd hear him arguing with Clara behind closed doors. Voices sharp, words about debts and losses. My stomach knotted every time I thought about how he'd sold my father's house. What if he lost everything else, too? Would I just be cast aside like old furniture? One evening, as I dusted the parlor, Eddie noticed me staring at a photograph of Mama. It was the only picture I had managed to keep, tucked carefully in a warm Bible I carried everywhere. He sneered, "Still clinging to the past, Maggie girl? Let it go. Your daddy's house is gone, your mama's gone, and you've got nothing but what I give you. Remember that." His words cut deep. I wanted to shout that he was wrong, that Mama and Daddy's love lived in me, that no piece of paper or money could erase them, but fear sealed my lips. I was alone, a child under his roof, and his power felt suffocating. But even in that fear, I began to resist in small ways. I kept my grades high, no matter how tired I was from chores. I wrote in a secret notebook, pouring out my grief and anger, promising myself I'd build a different future. I started working odd jobs, helping Sarah's family stock shelves or tutoring younger kids in reading. It wasn't much, but it gave me a little pocket money of my own. For the first time since losing Mama and Daddy, I felt a little bit of control. But Eddie noticed, and he didn't like it. One afternoon, he found the few dollars I had hidden under my mattress. He stormed into the attic, waving them in my face. "What's this? You think you can keep secrets from me? Everything you earn, everything you own comes through me. Don't forget that." I was 16, trembling with fear and fury. My voice cracked when I finally dared to speak back. "It's mine. I worked for it. You already took Daddy's house. You can't take this due." For a moment, his twisted in rage. I thought he might strike me, but then he smiled, that slick smile, the one that made my skin crawl. "You got spirit, Maggie girl, but spirit doesn't put food on the table. Best remember who holds the reins here." He pocketed the money and walked away. I collapsed on my cot, sobbing, clutching Mama's photo to my chest. That night, I felt more broken than ever, but I also felt something else, a spark of defiance that refused to die. Sarah noticed the change in me. "You can't let him keep you down," she whispered one day at school. "You are stronger than you think. One day you'll get out. You'll see." At the time, her words felt like a distant dream, but they planted a seed in me, a belief that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as powerless as Eddie wanted me to believe. Those years tested me in every way. I learned to endure hunger, loneliness, and cruelty. I learned to smile at church while hiding bruises on my spirit. But I also learned resilience. I learned that even in the harshest soil, hope can take root. I didn't know it yet, but life was about to shift in ways I could never have imagined. For all of the pain Eddie caused, fate had its own plans, and though justice was far away, it was moving quietly toward me, step by step.
By the time I turned 18, I had grown taller, thinner, and sharper around the edges. Life in Eddie's house carved me into something tougher than I ever imagined, though I hardly felt strong back then. I was just a girl clinging to scraps of dignity, trying to keep Mama's memory alive in my heart. Eddie, meanwhile, grew more restless. He was a man always chasing money, but money never stayed long in his hands. He gambled too much, drank too much, and trusted the wrong people. I could hear it in the hushed arguments he had with Aunt Clara late at night, debts piling up, creditors calling. And every time he lost another dollar, he grew meaner toward me, as if my very presence reminded him of a house he stole. One winter evening, I overheard something that made my stomach twist. Eddie was pacing in the parlor, his voice low but sharp. "She's nearly grown now," he muttered to Clara. "She's the burden, and I've got enough troubles. Maybe it's time we arrange something. Get her out of here. There's that widower farmer down near Fayetteville. He needs a young woman to keep house." My blood ran cold. A farmer? Twice my age, sold off like livestock? I stumbled back up the attic stairs, heart pounding, tears burning my eyes. I pressed Mama's photo to my lips and whispered, "Please, Mama, don't let him do this to me." The next day at school, I told Sarah. Her eyes widened, and she grabbed my hand. She said, "You can't let him decide your life, Margaret. You have choices." My parents, they'd never forgive themselves if they stood by and let him send you away. Maybe you could stay with us." Her words filled me with both hope and fear. Leave Eddie's house? Where would I go? What would people say? But the thought of being married off to some stranger chilled me to the bone. I didn't make a decision right then, but a seed was planted in my mind. Escape. As the months passed, Eddie's grip grew tighter. He locked away my notebooks when he found them, claiming I wasted paper. He sneered at my dreams of finishing school. "Girls don't need diplomas. Maggie, they need a roof and a man to put food on the table." But I held my ground quietly. I still worked odd jobs when I could. I tucked away coins in the lining of my coat, careful enough to get caught again. And I prayed. Every night I prayed for strength, for guidance, for some sign that Mama and Daddy were still watching over me. Then came the spring that changed everything. It was April, the dog goods blooming wide across the hills. One Eddie came home angrier than I had ever seen him. His shirt was rumpled, his tie loosened, and his face red with fury. "They've taken it all," he raged to Cura. "The bank won't give me another loan. The creditors are circling. Damn it all." I froze in the kitchen doorway, clutching the dish towel in my hands. His eyes flicked toward me, and a cruel smile spread across his face.
He said, "Well, Maggie, he looks like you'll be earning your keep after all. That farmer down south, he's still interested. I think it's time you packed your things." The room spun. My knees buckled, but I steadied myself on the counter. Clara said nothing but just pursed her lips and looked away. That night, lying awake in the attic, I realized the truth. If I stayed, Eddie would sell me off like I was nothing. If I wanted a life of my own, I had to leave. Not tomorrow, not someday. Soon. The chance came a week later. Sarah's family invited me to help with the store inventory overnight. Eddie, desperate for money, agreed, probably thinking I'd earn a bit he could pocket. But instead, I packed a few things I owned, Mama's photo, my Bible, a dress or two, and tucked them into a small bag. When I stepped out of Eddie's house that morning, the sky was painted pink with dawn. My heart raced, my legs trembled, but for the first time in years, I felt free air fill my lungs. I walked to Sarah's house, not knowing if Eddie would come after me, not knowing what tomorrow would hold. The Millers welcomed me with open arms. Mrs. Miller hugged me tight, whispering, "You're safe here, child. We won't let anyone hurt you." Mr. Miller, stern but kind, promised Eddie would not lay a hand on me. But safety came with a cost. Eddie stormed into their store 2 days later, demanded my return. His voice thundered through the aisles, his face twisted with rage. "She's my niece, my responsibility. You can't just keep her here." Mr. Miller stood firm. "She's 18 now, Eddie. She can choose where she lives, and by God, she chooses not to live under your roof." I stood behind the counter, trembling but resolute. For the first time, I met Eddie's eyes without lowering mine. His face darkened, and for a moment I thought he might strike me even there in public. But then he spat on the floor and stormed out. It wasn't over, of course. He tried to spread lies in town that I was ungrateful, that the Millers had turned me against him. But people had eyes. They saw how gaunt I had become in his house, how much brighter I looked with the Millers. Slowly the whispers turned against him. Living with the Millers was like stepping into a new world. I had chores, yes, but they were shared chores, done with laughter and fairness. I hated the table with everyone else. Mrs. Miller even mended my clothes with care, not resentment. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Still, the shadows of Eddie's betrayal clung to me. Nights, I'd wake up sweating, hearing his voice in my dreams, "You got nothing but what I give you." But every morning, the warmth of the Miller household reminded me otherwise. I was beginning to see a future that belonged to me, not to him. And yet the story wasn't finished. Life had more turns ahead, harder ones, but ones that would lead me toward justice, even if it took years.
Those first months with the Millers felt like breathing clean air after years in a smoke-filled room. For the first time since Mama and Daddy's passing, I could sleep without fear that someone would drag me away in the night. I could laugh without worrying it might be called disrespectful. And most of all, I could begin to dream again. I finished high school while living under their roof. Every night after supper, I'd spread my books across the kitchen table, and Sarah would sit beside me, scribbling her own notes. Mrs. Miller would hum softly as she darned socks, and Mr. Miller would sip his coffee, keeping an eye on the store ledger. It wasn't just a house, it was a home. The kind of home I thought I'd lost forever. When I walked across that stage at graduation, wearing a borrowed white dress and clutching my diploma, I spotted Eddie in the crowd. He stood off to the side, arms folded, his expression sour. Clara wasn't with them. For a moment, fear prickled at my skin, but then I saw the Millers cheering, Sarah waving wildly, and I lifted my chin. That day was mine, not his.
After graduation, I wanted to continue school, maybe become a teacher. But money was tight, and I knew the Millers had already done more for me than I could ever repay. So I took a job at the town library, a small brick building with dusty shelves and kind old Mrs. Henderson at the desk. I shelved books, helped children find stories, and lost myself in the smell of paper and ink. It wasn't riches, but it gave me independence and hope. Eddie, of course, didn't stay quiet. He came into the library one afternoon, slick as ever, with that smug smile. "Well, well, Maggie girl, look at you, playing librarian. But don't think working here makes you grown. You still owe me, after all I did for you." My stomach turned, but I stood straighter. "I don't owe you anything, Uncle Eddie. You stole from me. You sold my daddy's house." His smile faltered for a split second, then returned sharper. "Careful, girl. Folks might believe your little stories, but paper doesn't lie. The deed was in my name." I knew he was twisting the truth, using words I didn't fully understand back then. But deep down, I believed one day the truth would surface. Still, hearing him try to rewrite history made my chest ache with rage. He leaned closer. "Don't forget, I can make your life difficult. Best keep your mouth shut if you want to keep that job." My hand shook, but I refused to lower my eyes. "Go ahead and try. I'm not afraid of you anymore." That night, I cried in my bed at the Miller's house, not because I was weak, but because I was finally strong enough to see him for what he really was. A bully, a thief, a coward hiding behind smooth words. Years rolled forward. I worked at the library, saved every penny, and even took night classes at the community college. Sarah married a kind man named Daniel and started her own family. I was thrilled for her, though I sometimes wondered if I'd ever find someone who could see past my scars. Then one autumn afternoon, I met James. He was tall, with dark hair and gentle eyes, a young man studying to be a teacher. He came to the library often, asking for books on history, always returning them with neat notes in the margins. One day, he asked if I liked to walk by the river. I said yes. That was the start of something new, something I didn't even realize my heart had been longing for. James listened when I told him pieces of my story. He didn't pity me. He admired my strength. He said, "You've been through hell, Maggie, but you're still here. That takes courage." One evening, as we sat on the riverbank, the water glimmering gold with sunset, he said, "You've been through hell, Maggie, but you're still here. That takes courage." We married 2 years later in the Miller's backyard beneath the dogwood tree. I wore a simple blue dress and Sarah stood by my side. The Millers gave me away as if they were their own daughter. I cried through half the ceremony, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming grace of finally being loved and wanted. Eddie didn't attend. Word was his gambling debts had grown worse. He had lost the fancy white house and moved into a shabby apartment on the edge of town. Clara stayed with him, though she looked worn and bitter whenever I saw her at the market. For a while, I thought maybe I could put the past behind me. I built a life with James, and soon we had children of our own. I poured every ounce of love into them, determined they'd never feel the hunger and loneliness I once knew. But the past has a way of finding you. One summer day, years after I'd left his house, Eddie appeared at our doorstep. His hair was thinner, his suits rumpled, but his smile was the same oily grin. "Well, well, Maggie girl, look at you,
playing librarian. But don't think working here makes you grown. You still owe me after all I did for you. My stomach's turned, but I stood straighter. I don't owe you anything, Uncle Eddie. You stole from me. You saw my daddy's house. His eyes narrowed. But careful, girl. There are things you don't understand. Your daddy's land, it wasn't yours to begin with. I had the right. No, you had no right. And one day, people will know what you did. I shut the door in his face. My heart hammered, but I felt lighter than in years. James wrapped his arm around me and whispered, "You're free of him, Maggie. He can't touch you anymore." I wanted to believe that, and in a way I did. But deep down, I still longed for justice, not just freedom. I wanted the truth of Eddie's betrayal to come into the light so no other girl would suffer the way I had. And as if fate had been listening all along, that justice was closer than I ever realized.
Years passed and life moved forward, though that shadow of betrayal still lingered at the back of my mind. James and I raised 3 children, each one more curious, stubborn, and loving than the last. I cooked Sunday dinners, read bedtime stories, and mended scraped knees. Outwardly, it seemed Eddie had disappeared from our lives. But I never stopped waiting for the day when truth would finally stand taller than lies. That day came in a way I hadn't expected. It was a spring morning when a knock rattled our front door. A man stood there in a neat gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Mr. Collins, an attorney handling some old property disputes in Kentucky. He asked if I was Margaret Johnson, daughter of William and Ruth Johnson. My heart skipped. I said, yes. He explained that in the county records, there had been inconsistencies regarding my parents' property, the land Eddie had claimed as his. A recent audit showed forged signatures, false documents, and Eddie's name tied to it all. The truth was finally documented in ink and paper, not just in my aching memory. I sat at our kitchen table, hands shaking as I read the report. Tears spilled down my cheeks, not because I was surprised. I had always known Eddie's betrayal, but because at last there was proof. When the news spread, the town whispered. Eddie's reputation, already frayed from years of debts and schemes, unraveled completely. People crossed the street to avoid him. Clara left, finally weary of his lies. He ended up alone at a rundown boarding house, bitter and forgotten. I didn't rejoice in his downfall, not exactly, but there was a quiet justice in it. The man who had stolen my childhood, who had tried to break me, was finally seen for who he really was. One evening, sitting with my grandchildren on the porch, I told them my story. Not every grim detail, but enough for them to understand. They gasped and cried and hugged me tighter than ever. But Granny, one of them asked softly, "How did you survive all that?" I looked out at the sunset, painting the sky pink and gold. I said, because love found me when I thought I'd lost it forever, because kindness from the Millers, strength from James, and hope inside my own heart carried me through. They were quiet a moment, then another little voice piped up, "And because you didn't let Uncle Eddie win." I smiled through my tears. That's right. Evil may steal from you, hurt you, even break you down. But if you hold on to goodness,
to love and to truth. No betrayal can take your soul." The porch grew quiet, save for the sound of cicadas singing in the dusk. My story had been heavy, but sharing it made my shoulders lighter, as if generations of pain had finally been set down. And as I watched my grandchildren chasing fireflies in the yard, laughter spilling into the warm night air, I knew I had won, not through revenge, not through anger, but by building a life filled with love, the very thing Eddie could never touch.